everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is HarrisX founder and CEO, Dritan Nesho. Dritan, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me back. Happy New Year, Brittany.
Happy New Year to you as well. You have a new Harvard Caps Harris poll out. It's wide-ranging, but I want to start where we usually do, and that's President Trump's approval rating. He's been in office now, his second term, for a little over a year, and as of now, what are voters thinking of him?
Well, President Trump was doing fairly well by his job approval rating standards heading into the new year. And of course, over the last few weeks, if you will, he's taken several hits, one on immigration. The second one is this lingering dynamic of unhappiness around the economy and voters' perceptions around the economy. And then certainly there are some concerns around foreign affairs, maybe pushing the envelope too much with our NATO allies and our European allies when it comes to Greenland. And so his approval rating receded a little bit. It fell to 45% from 47%, where it was mid to late December. And what we've noticed is drops really across the board on all of the different issues that we track that make up the job approval. So he went on the economy down still from 44 to 43%. That's a small movement, but it shows that he's underwater. On immigration, he went from 49% to 46%. That's a meaningful shift, especially month over month. Foreign affairs from 45% to 42%. Administering the government from 45% to 43%, reducing costs of the government from 48 to 44%, returning America to its values, which is an area that he has been above water at 50% or better most of his first year in office. He fell down from 50% to 45%. And I think that highlights the challenges of the, I would say now, old approach on immigration in Minneapolis and Minnesota. And obviously, we've got lots of data to unpack together over the next 30 minutes or hour on specifically that issue. So I'll pause there for the audience. Obviously, the president is not doing badly. 45% approval at this stage is a healthy approval rating, but he was doing better. I think that's the key takeaway.
And I want to get into those specific issues, right? Because you and I spoke all leading up to 2024, and the top two issues facing voters largely were the economy and immigration. And at the end of the day, President Trump won in large part because voters thought he was better at handling those issues than President Biden and then Vice President Kamala Harris. And I want to talk about the economy because you and I, when President Trump was first sworn in, you talked about how voters are going to give him some leeway, right? They're upset about the economy, but they think it's President Biden's economy. They don't yet put that onus on President Trump. Now, though, based on these numbers, it seems like the onus is squarely on President Trump. Talk to us about that.
That's right. I mean, one of the biggest shifts within the survey, a double-digit shift from December, is around the question of whose economy is it? Who owns this economy? You've seen to date President Trump say, well, I inherited a mess, an economic mess from Biden. And as you mentioned, people for about the first 6 to 9 months gave him leeway on economic questions. But when it comes to today, 63%, so close to 2/3, say that Trump owns the economy. It's his economy. And when we asked it, is it better or worse than it was under Biden, 53% said worse, 47% said better. So those numbers have been largely split. In December, it was 50-50. But you see how fragile economic perceptions are. And in so many ways, the challenge that faces the White House, which might be, frankly, the deciding challenge entering into the midterms and moving beyond, is really reversing perceptions around the economy, because the economy is only as good as voters perceive it to be. And right now, 56% of voters believe that the economy is shrinking, where actually it is growing on a fairly healthy basis, right? In the last quarter numbers that we had, the economy was growing over 3%, close to 4%, right? Then you ask them, do you think inflation is above or below 3%? Inflation is currently below 3%. 66% say it's above 3%, right? So again, two-thirds have these lingering negative perceptions of where the country really is. And again, this is a very big challenge. Voters' perception of the economy usually trails the reality of the economy anywhere by 6 months to sometimes, a year and even more. And right now, the polling indicates that voters feel that Trump is spending too much time on issues other than the economy and perhaps too much time on foreign issues rather than domestic issues. And again, that's a challenge for the White House to overcome as they head into the midterms.
And I know Groundhog Day was literally yesterday, but it feels like Groundhog Day again with messaging on the economy. Because we remember in 2024, Democrats saying, the economy's not that bad. People were saying, no, it feels really bad to me. It feels more expensive now. Life is just too expensive. Now it seems like Republicans are doing the same type of thing. And something I noticed in this poll, when you're looking at if people think the country's on the right track or wrong track is 38%, wrong track is 52%. And then when you look at the numbers where people are at when it comes to the economy, people think the economy is on the right track. That's at 38%, wrong track, 53%. So these numbers are just so tied. I mean, they are almost identical. So how important is the economy going to be in the midterms, which obviously every election, it's the economy stupid. But what do voters want from leadership right now when it comes to the economy?
Well, the economy will be the key issue heading into the midterms. You see that part of the reason why the Trump administration is trying to highlight immigration as an issue is to increase its salience in voters' eyes. And again, immigration was one of the reasons why Trump won the last presidential election. The problem is that they have elevated immigration to be a top two issue, along with affordability, inflation, economy, and jobs. And that's clear in our poll, but they did it in all the wrong ways, right? And now they have to pivot, and two-thirds don't believe that they're pivoting, or 6 in 10 actually don't believe that they have pivoted yet. So the White House is in a delicate situation right now because the issue that they elevated to energize the base was not handled in the appropriate way, and the issue that makes the most difference to voters is the issue of affordability still. And this is the challenge in general of inflation versus unemployment, right? Inflation, you can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? You can't reduce prices and make things quote unquote affordable again. You have to grow the economy and you have to grow the real earning potential of employees within the economy in order to make them feel confident that their earning potential is where it was before. Whereas, unemployment, when it shifts a percentage points or two, if 1 out of 20 of your friends are unemployed all of a sudden, maybe you would notice, maybe you wouldn't, right? It's frankly something that the administration and any administration has a lot more control around. So yes, the economy is the pivotal issue. It's the top issue. And it's very likely that at this stage, the midterms are make or break on the question of the economy and the White House's ability to turn perceptions around the economy.
Immigration is the number 2 issue. And there was this perception that President Biden and then Vice President Kamala Harris, they didn't have a strong grasp at handling immigration, at handling securing the southern border. And border crossings are down dramatically from when President Biden was in office. But that's not the news when it comes to immigration, right? The news is what we're seeing in Minnesota and specifically Minneapolis, because in January alone, 2 people died. They were fatally shot by federal agents as a large immigration enforcement operation is underway in Minnesota since late last year. And there's videos going viral of ICE interactions with people. And there have been more critics, both Democrats and Republicans alike, that are really feeling the word that I have heard is queasy from the interactions with ICE. They're saying that ICE's tactics are too aggressive. How are people right now feeling about President Trump's immigration policies?
Well, they clearly view the tactics employed by ICE and Border Patrol as being too aggressive. Close to 6 in 10 of voters hold that opinion right now. And as we just talked, they do not consider this the right application of immigration enforcement. So we asked a question within the poll, um, and different tiers and different categories of illegal migrants in the country and even legal migrants in the country. And there's a consensus that if they've committed serious crimes, then they shouldn't be here, whether or not they're illegal or came in with the proper visa and are here on a legal status. But if it's minor infractions, if these people have spent a long time in the United States, voters are not for these kinds of tactics in terms of approaching and kicking out these undocumented immigrants. And so immigration is very interesting as an issue because voters are dead center in terms of a reasonable approach on immigration. I'll explain what I mean by that in just a second. They're not at the extremes. So one side, they do still want strong borders. And when you ask them about the concept of sanctuary cities and whether or not local authorities should collaborate with immigration agencies and enforcement agencies to kick out criminal, illegal aliens in the country, 67%, a whooping 67% say yes, there should be cooperation and local authorities should hand over these criminal, illegal aliens. So this is one of the key arguments that the Trump administration has employed, and it holds traction, which is, these local authorities aren't cooperating with us. That's why we have to do this sweeping immigration raids in the way that we have done. At the same time, the data when it comes to what is happening in Minnesota is striking, right? 58% say that ICE and Border Patrol has been using too much force. 57% say that it's gone too far in terms of its actions. 56% say that it's not justified. 61% say that they're acting below the norms of law enforcement and are targeting or harassing regular citizens who disagree with the policies. 62% say that ICE and CBP today has been violating civil liberties, which again, these are very, very worrying numbers if you're in the White House. And 62% believe that it was the fault of ICE in the 2 deaths of American citizens for escalating too quickly. And worryingly for the administration, 59%, as I mentioned a little while ago, believe that the administration is still doubling down on its actions and has not really begun de-escalating or changing course, which in fact the administration did by replacing Greg Bovino with Tom Homan and having him lead the charge going forward in Minneapolis, and also shifting from sweeping raids to very, very targeted approach. And as a consequence of this, the political dynamic is a very challenging dynamic. When we asked voters, should Republicans withhold funding for DHS in the funding bill that's going through Congress right now, 55% said yes. They're not quite ready for Democrats to trigger a shutdown, so 53% said the shutdown is not the right path. But really, voters are on edge, and they're asking Republicans to really keep the administration on track and create guardrails. And then one of the questions that we asked last week, which has since become policy for DHS, is 86%, a whooping 86%, want all immigration enforcement agents to wear body cameras. And 80% believe that during enforcement activities, they should identify themselves. So again, the way that these immigration push was conducted in the last 30 days was in many ways the wrong approach. And again, voters have penalized the administration because of that. And you see that in the dip in approval for President Trump. And again, this is very important because if you look at the overall set of issues that the Trump administration has promised and is still pushing, 15 out of the 20 issues still have majority support amongst the country. And that's a very good and very strong starting place. And maybe that's why the trajectory was a positive trajectory for the president's approval numbers. And then you have something like this, and it all brings it all down, like the Zeppelin, right? And so, again, the administration still has the ability to reverse course on immigration, and it has reversed course. But really, the old approach was wrong in so many ways, and voters are expressing that very clearly.
And voters expressed clearly, though, that they thought Democrats were too soft on their immigration stance. Now it's almost like Goldilocks, right? That was too soft. This is too tough. Where are voters going to be in the midterms when it comes to this and when it comes to the economy? Does this hurt Republicans? How much does this help Democrats, if at all? What can you tell us there?
Well, I think that if the administration is able to highlight the wins on immigration, closing the border, getting rid of criminal aliens, then that's something that voters will reward. If the negatives of the immigration push and the enforcement and the more extreme elements of the White House are leading the immigration push, then they will punish the administration. So immigration right now, it's like playing with fire. Yes, it can warm you, but it can also burn you. And so I think that the dust still hasn't settled on the immigration push, which again highlights why these initiatives around the economy are so important, right? And keeping the focus on the economy is so important because that is, again, um, an issue where the administration is on a back footing, but the substance of the economy is actually positive, right? The economy is doing much better than it was doing 12 months ago. Whether the administration is making it burn hot or not, it's a different question. But right now, the key indicators and the key metrics are positive ones. And again, being able to close that gap will be essential for the midterms.
And usually, historically, when one party has control of the White House, Congress, and the Senate, it's good for the other party coming in to the midterms. Usually, it works out better for them. And this poll shows good news for Democrats. When you're looking at the midterms, Democrats hold an 8-point lead on the generic ballot against Republicans amongst registered voters and a 4-point lead amongst likely voters. Talk to us about where Democrats are right now as well as where Republicans are, as we're just less than a year from the midterms, if you can believe it.
Yeah, I mean, look, that gap between all registered voters, where Democrats have an eight-point lead, and likely voters, where it shrinks to 4 points. And again, the margin of error on this poll is 2 percentage points. That tells you everything. The Republican base is still a lot more energized and a lot more engaged than the Democratic base. The Democratic base has confidence issues within its leadership and feels that the Democrats still haven't landed on a strategy on how to tackle the Trump administration. And you see also a lot of division. So these numbers are very fragile for the Democrats, right? They're not a reason to celebrate in any way, shape, or form. And when you ask the question with a lot more choice, Democrat, Republican, third party, or I'm unsure right now, then amongst registered voters, it's a dead heat, 41% to 41%. And I think that also shows that there's really weakness for Democrats amongst some of the core groups that they need to move over in order to win the midterm. So I would say that all eyes are on independent voters. Right now, independent voters are, starting to lean towards the Democrats because of the economy, because of immigration, the mishandling of the immigration issue in the last 30 days, and so on and so forth, but they can still snap back. And then one of the key findings from the last election is that the only demographic group that on their own mattered, right, could have tipped the election on their own was Hispanic voters or Latino voters. Hispanic and Latino voters, they are economic voters. These are very, very rational, very bread and butter, tabletop issues voters. And again, this group holds the power in the middle. Of course, President Trump has given prominence to key Hispanic figures like Marco Rubio is addressing issues within Central America and South America when it comes to drugs, the cartels, and obviously the action in Venezuela is something that was very well received amongst Hispanic voters. The question is that enough? Or will they just take it and then focus on the issue that again matters the most, which is the economy? And so we're really in a it's the economy stupid type situation. And again, as you and I have often joked in this show, it's always Trump v. Trump, right? It's not that the Democrats are doing anything that's spectacular, is that the president's execution of his policies, which the majority voters support, is the equivalent of shooting oneself in the foot in many cases. And you see that even when the White House has the right idea, the challenge is they go about executing things in a too brazen a way, in too brash a way, too chaotic a way, and people don't want that. They don't want chaos. They want clarity and predictability when it comes to policymaking.
And I know earlier in this conversation, you said that voters want President Trump to focus more on issues that matter to them, like the economy. I'm curious if they think Venezuela is one of those issues. And just to remind everyone, 1 month ago, U.S. forces launched an operation in the capital of Venezuela that resulted in the capture of the country's sitting leader, Nicolas Maduro. President Trump, right after that, said the United States is going to run Venezuela until they can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition, and then we would also be heavily involved in the country's oil industry. How do voters feel about this? Are they happy that Maduro is now out of Venezuela? Are they happy that there's U.S. involvement in a foreign government for an undetermined amount of time? What does that look like?
Great questions. Yes, they're absolutely happy that Maduro is out. 72% of voters, so close to three-fourths, viewed him as a dictator who was illegitimate and did not represent the will of the Venezuelan people. And actually, close to 6 in 10 of voters, 59%, believed that it was in the national security interests of the United States to get rid of Maduro. And they, at the time when the action occurred, most voters, a majority, said that the Democrats should have shown more unity with Trump in pushing for this. Those numbers have now receded a little bit because Venezuela is not front and center, so it's more of a split. But really, the U.S. voters have a very pragmatic view on Venezuela. They believe that the U.S. should fix the Venezuelan oil industry. Half of them, or close to half, believe that the U.S. is entitled to proceeds from fixing Venezuela's oil industry. So they align with Trump on that. But two-fourths, 64%, actually believe that some kind of a democratic transition, clearly communicated with a clear timeline, should be a key priority of the administration. And this is something that President Trump hasn't offered yet. So voters want Venezuela to be democratic. Voters want Venezuela to be an ally country, not in the pocket of China or in the pocket of Russia, in the pocket of all of America's strategic competitors. And I think that whether or not Venezuela is seen as a success story or not will actually be on how this transition is handled. Right now, Venezuela is a qualified win for the administration, but time will tell. And really, that's what voters are saying through the data that we have on Venezuela.
Right after that Venezuela operation, President Trump described his foreign policy as saying, "We've superseded the Monroe Doctrine. We are now in the Don Road Doctrine." And he
Yeah.
used that Don Road Doctrine foreign policy push to justify his desire to acquire Greenland. He said that we need this territory for national security purposes. But that's not only ruffled the feathers of the people and leadership of both Denmark and Greenland, it's also ruffled the feathers of NATO countries. How do voters feel about his push for Greenland?
Well, it's also an interesting picture on the Donroe Doctrine. So, look, when it comes to supporting or opposing Trump resetting the United States relationship with European nations, so they contribute more to the defense and lower tariffs on U.S. goods, 62% actually support Trump in doing that. But when it comes to Greenland, only about 40% say that we should go at it alone and pursue our national security interests without bearing in mind that on the other side, it's our traditional allies in Europe and in NATO. And actually, when you force the question, is it more important to sustain NATO as it is, as an alliance of mostly democracies that support each other in times of war and the security pact? 70% actually say NATO is more important than Greenland. So the president, the reason why he pivoted is because the support isn't there for an outside land grab on Greenland. However, American voters believe that the citizens of Greenland should be given a choice. So they have a very democratic perspective in terms of what should happen. They say, don't use force, try to negotiate with the Europeans what you want, but at the end of the day, they actually believe that anything and everything, including an outcome on the extremes, Greenland staying with the Kingdom of Denmark or Greenland seceding from the Kingdom of Denmark and becoming an associated state of the United States, like Puerto Rico, or a member of the United States, should actually go through a vote and through a referendum. And I think that that is one of the neglected elements of conversation to date, which is, have we asked the people of Greenland on what their vote would be? And if their vote is a resounding no, then everyone has to accept the self-determination of the people of Greenland and move forward on that. So I think that we're not done with Greenland as an issue. It's going to keep coming back because there's a lot of security interest and also economic interest when it comes to Arctic trade and also the availability of rare earth minerals there. But voters are not for an extreme position on it, and they do not want to risk the NATO alliance over Greenland. And that comes across clearly in the data. That's a 70-30 split in favor of keeping NATO strong and while trying to reform how NATO does what it does and the contributions that the Europeans are putting into NATO.
I want to look to the Middle East now and talk about Iran. Let's start about late December. We saw protests erupt, then going through January because of the economy there, as well as general protests against the regime. And as a result, reports indicated that thousands of people were killed, even more than that were arrested. And in mid-January, President Trump, he said he's with the Iranian people. He told them to keep protesting. He said help was on the way. He said MAGA, make Iran great again. And at the end of the month, President Trump said that a massive armada was headed towards Iran. He urged the country's leadership to come to the table and negotiate a nuclear deal, or the next attack, he said, was going to be far worse than the summer attack on some of Iran's nuclear strikes. Reports indicate that U.S. and Iranian officials are set to meet later this week. And President Trump, earlier this week, he said that if things don't work out with Iran in these conversations, probably bad things would happen. What are voters' thoughts on the regime, A, and B, the United States' involvement in trying to talk with them and trying to reach this deal on Iran's nuclear program?
So the White House has a lot more leeway in shaping perceptions around Iran. That's because 70% still think that Iran is building its nuclear capability or is trying to build it, in a subterfugeous way. 67% believe that the people of Iran do not support the current regime, and 59% would support regime change. And actually, when you ask a hard-hitting question, do you think that taking down the Iranian regime would be more likely to open the door to Middle East peace by destroying a chief sponsor of terrorism in the region, which voters believe that the regime in Iran is? Or is it more likely to lead to chaos and instability? 53% say that it's going to lead to Middle Eastern peace. The perceptions of the regime in Iran amongst the American body politic are very negative, and frankly, because of due cause, right? Because of the actions that the Iranians have undertaken over many years and many decades. So the president has a lot more leeway in shaping public opinion there and selling in a strike on Iran. Right now, only about 3 in 10 voters support a strike because of the protester deaths, the 20,000 or 30,000 protester deaths that have occurred at the hand of the regime. But the data here can shift and has shifted in the past a lot more. So this is an area to keep an eye out on because the administration can set the agenda in many different ways. Right now, the administration's perspective is to trade on the threat of action for major concessions for a weakened Iranian regime, an Iranian regime that doesn't have its Russian backers because Russia is so weak given the war in Ukraine, and certainly has limited support only from its Chinese backers. So we'll see, right? I think that a strike is possible, but a diplomatic breakthrough is even more likely because of the weakened position of the Iranian regime. And again, it's something to keep an eye out on over the next 30 days or so, especially given the U.S. Navy is now in theater, right? There are several carrier groups now around Iran, and that gives the White House the opportunity to exercise a course of action at any given point in time.
Dritan, we talked about the economy, domestic issues, foreign policy, weak spots and strong spots for the administration in general. And I'm curious what this all means for 2028, if you can believe it, another presidential election. Who do voters want in general? What type of candidate are they craving? What does it all look like?
Well, that's a great question, and actually, I'm going to go through some specific data that we asked in terms of voters' perceptions of who they want as the next president of the United States. I mean, I think that voters right now think that both Democratic leadership and Republican leadership are too far to the extreme. So when you ask them on one side about someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Zohran Mamdani, 55% say that they would be a danger if elected to higher office. Still, only 45% say great public servants. And then you see similar numbers on the Republican side as well when you mention names like, say, Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens or some of the more sort of extreme members. I think that Trump um, has an opportunity to move to the center. He's still seen as being more on the far right, as in terms of his leadership and in terms of his management than on the center right. 44% say he's on the far right, 36% say that he's on the center right, and then about 21% say he's left of center. And when you ask voters really what do you want in your next president? The plurality say that they want someone who's center right, 44%, followed by 31% who say that they want someone on the center left, and only 15% on the far right and 10% on the far left. So what does that mean? That means that America is a center of right country. And that means that 2028 especially given the fact that, again, a majority of the administration's initiatives still have support by most of the voters, this is the Republicans' race to lose. A lot can happen between now and then, a lot of missteps, as we just saw on immigration, and that will greatly condition how voters perceive the administration. But it's clear from the data that they want a slightly conservative leader going forward into the 2028 elections. And we also asked who would be the next preferred candidate on both sides. And on the Republican side, JD Vance is the clear winner with 53%, followed by Donald Trump Jr. at 21% and Marco Rubio at 17%. This is amongst all voters. No, sorry, this is amongst Republicans. And then when you ask Democrats, it's really a race between Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom. Kamala Harris is at 39%, Newsom is at 30% in our data, and then you see a steep drop off after that for other figures. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, we have a lot of polling on Harris. She's not seen as center left. She's seen as left or far left. So I think that that gives Newsom a lot of opportunity to move up. And then the question on the Republican side will be, how is J.D. Vance seen? Is he seen as the far right, in which case he might fall into some of the same traps as Trump has? Or can he position himself center right, carry the MAGA coalition, but also carry those coveted swing voters, moderate voters in the middle who make the difference? And I think that it's still a wide open race with a lot to happen in the next 3 years.
I wanted to ask about that because if 2028 is Republicans' race to lose, if Vice President J.D. Vance has this overwhelming popularity in being the GOP's nominee, but a plurality of voters think that President Trump governs too far right, is that bad news for him, considering he's considered, by and large, the heir apparent?
Well, look, I think that the White House has to resist the more radical elements within the White House. Voters are, again, dead center when it comes to reason, right? They want reasonable approaches. They want stability, clarity, predictability. And on so many of the key issues, they would prefer grand bargains between Republicans and Democrats and vice versa, rather than this constant infighting. And I think that if the better angels of the White House's nature dominate, right, and are able to move forward the administration from the center right, then yes, this administration and its heir apparent are in a strong position heading into 2028. If it's the worst angels of their nature, then then it will be another difficult fight in 2028, similar to what we saw in 2024.
Dritan, I think something everyone can agree on is that it feels like it's been quite a year already, right? With this news cycle, both domestic news, foreign news, everything in between, but it's only the beginning of February, if you can believe it. So I think that means that we have, hopefully, a lot of conversations in store between now and midterms, as well as now and the 2028 presidential election. But it's always a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for the great questions. Thank you for the great reporting by Team Forbes, and hopefully we'll be back over the next month with some fresh data around the State of the Union to share with your viewers.